Hey, thanks so much for checking out our content here at Harvest Church. We're so glad you decided to join us whenever and wherever you're watching. Thanks so much for making us part of your day. If you would, just click that subscribe button. We would love for you to do that. Also, go to Facebook and Instagram and follow and like us there. We would love for you to see all more about our church and keep up with information and just to follow along with us. Also, you can check out Behind the Harvest podcast. That is on Apple and Google Play. We would love for you to check that out as well. Hey, as a church, we exist so that all people may know Jesus and grow with him. And we are right in the middle of a Fruit Inspectors series. And we are talking about patience today. And I'm going to give you the bottom line at the beginning and then try to unpack it, okay? So this is it. Wisdom doesn't always work out immediately. But with patience, we gain wisdom ultimately. Say it one more time. Wisdom doesn't always work out immediately, but with patience, we gain wisdom ultimately. So we're going to go to a book in the Old Testament, Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes is written by King Solomon, who was the wisest man in all of the world, one of King David's sons, who also built the temple. And so he wrote Proverbs, wisest man in the world. And this is what he says. He says in Ecclesiastes 7:8, better is the end of a thing than its beginning. And the patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. So let's explore the context a little bit. Ecclesiastes presents a naturalistic view of life. It recognizes God's sovereignty in the world, God's sovereignty in someone's life, God's rule and reign over the world. But it is very naturalistic and it is very applicable to our life. It's like words of wisdom, if you will. It's like sitting down with your grandfather or an older person and them just kind of giving you those pearls of wisdom. So when we read Ecclesiastes, I always like to think I'm sitting down with a cup of coffee with King Solomon at a table or in a rocking chair on a front porch, and he's just telling me about life. So that's what it is. Ecclesiastes represents a journey through life. It is essentially a commentary of life through the eyes of King Solomon. And again, he's the wisest man who's ever lived. Now, I want to be very clear on this, okay? So I'm going to read a little bit of it. So the writing, therefore, while not directly prescriptive, meaning how to apply it, it is a description from the wisest man who has ever lived, and therefore, it would be wise for us to apply it to our life. Okay, it would be wise for us to pull up a chair and listen and say, let me listen a little bit closer, because while he's not actually saying to us, this is what you need to do, he is providing his wise commentary. And if we were to listen to it, we're like, maybe it'd be really good to heed these words. Now, the context of this writing, when we get to verse 8, sees verse 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 kind of give a little bit of what is pitting one thing against the other, saying one thing is better than the other. So here's what he says in verse 1, a good name and a precious ornament. Number 2, house of mourning and a house of feasting. Verse 3, sorrow and laughter. Verse 4, heart of the wise versus heart of fools. Verse 5, rebuke of the wise and song of fools. And in verse 8, patience and pride. So Solomon uses these comparisons as ways to make commentary of the fact that one is preferred over the other, and to deliver wisdom to the reader to apply the preferred one in their life. So that's a lot of words. Basically just saying, look, one thing's better than the other, and the thing that's better, you should just put it in your life, and you should believe me because I'm the wisest dude that's ever lived. Simple, okay? So patience and pride. So Solomon uses an example, end versus beginning, to highlight his major point. Okay, you could make a whole sermon out of end versus beginning, but to highlight his major point, which is basically this: patience is of greater value than pride. Okay, patience is greater value than pride. So I want to start with that and then say, why is the end better than the beginning? To try to tease this out a little bit. The reason that the end is better than the beginning is this: it gives it time to see something mature. By the time something is ended, it can be fully appreciated. When something ends, we can evaluate the entirety of it. Over time, things typically get better with age. Okay? So let me give you an example. A few examples. First, judging a movie before it ends. How many of you guys have done that? I've done it. I've seen other people do it. Actually, it's really annoying to me. But the most memorable movies have the most unforgettable endings. Think about your favorite movie. What made it amazing to you? Oftentimes, it's the ending. If the ending is not great, a lot of times the movie's not great. A movie cannot be fully appreciated at the start. There's been no character development, there's no understanding of the plot, and no one knows how it's going to end yet. So that's one example of how the ending is better than the beginning. How about memories? Memories aren't fully appreciated until later. When you experience something, you don't know what type of memory it will be later. However, when you look back at pictures, or when you look back in your mind at that event or whatever, that moment is appreciated more. I'm going to give you a couple of them just with my kids. I was looking at a picture on my iPad just yesterday when we record this, just yesterday, and I saw a picture of when I took Caleb when he was 6 years old to hike his first 14,000-foot mountain, Mount Sherman. And I sat back and I was like, man, that's a day I'll never forget. In that moment, when we were doing it, didn't even think about that. We were just going to go climb a mountain. We were going to have fun, whatever. Now I look back, I'm like, man, I'll never forget that day. When he was 6 years old, we took him up Mount Sherman, and I can remember points of it vividly. Memories get better over time. I remember when I took Micah to his first Georgia game. We were all fired up, all excited to go and experience it. And I remember on the way home in the truck, he's asleep. We're driving down the road. It's dark, listening to the post-game show. And I thought to myself, this is a day I'll never forget. Like I just had a day that literally for my whole life, I will never forget. That's what memories are like. We can't fully appreciate them, but over time we do fully appreciate them. We see their impact. That's why the end is better than beginning. And think about relationships. They're always better over time. More life experiences, more ups and downs. There are bonds that are formed. I bet if you're thinking about someone who's married and you've been married for a long time, you would most of the people that I've ever met that have been married for a long time, they're like, the ending is way better than it was at the beginning, because you're still trying to figure out, do you push toothpaste out the top or do you roll it up from the bottom? You're still trying to figure out how you're going to live together and all that kind of stuff. And honestly, I'll say this, for me and Sarah, this is our 13th year being married. It's way better now than it was in the beginning. And so when Solomon talks about this, he's saying, listen, the ending is better than the beginning, so that he can kind of set it up to say in the same way that patience is better than pride. Meaning a patient spirit, one that allows time to see something fully formed, and one that exercises patience to gain greater wisdom, is better than a prideful spirit, one who may jump to conclusions before it is necessary. And so, how do these things kind of play off of each other, if you will? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take just a couple of scenarios and do kind of what Solomon did at the beginning. Remember verse 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then 8, he kind of pits one thing against the other and says one is more preferred. Well, we're going to do this with patience. And so here's a couple of points with patience. Patience doesn't overreact, meaning it's more perspective driven and less impulse driven. Okay? So patience doesn't overreact. It's more perspective driven than impulse driven. What do I mean by that? You don't see impulsive, patient people. It's just funny to me to say, you don't see impulsive, patient people. You see emotional, impulsive people. If you choose to be driven by your emotions, you're going to be impulsive. But here's the thing. Patience, I think, recognizes true emotions versus real emotions. Every emotion is real, but not every emotion is true. And so patience says, you know what? That emotion that I feel, that is real. But I don't have to be impulsive about it. I don't have to jump to conclusions about it, because it may not be true. It just may not be true. And so it's able to determine real versus true, and it's perspective driven. Patient people want the perspective more than they want to jump to conclusions. Patient people want to wait and ask some more questions. They want to see how things mature. They want to see things take shape over time, and then they'll evaluate it, but they don't get impulsive. Right? Patience is there to gain perspective, and perspective is often gained through experience. And life experience, when evaluated, teaches us patience. When I was in seminary, I was teaching full time. We were planting a church, and I was just done. And there was a lesser degree that I could get. Okay, I was going for a THM. It's another 120 hours. It's a beast. But there was a degree that I could get that was about 70 hours, and I was around 50 hours or whatnot. And I went to this thing called a Shine Session, where two older gentlemen just sit at a table and ask you questions for like 2 hours. It's actually awesome. And when we got to the end, I said, I just really think I need to cut it short, forget the THM, do this thing. I'll be done in like 6 months or whatever. And one of them asked me the question. They said, this is like a 65-year-old man. He said, so how long would it take you to get the THM? I said, probably another 2 years. And then he asked me this question, what's 2 years? And I said, everything. I'm like 29. He said, I'm 65. 2 years is nothing. What? He's like, to you, it's a lot. But you have less life experience than I do. On this end of 65, I'm telling you, 2 years is a blip on the map. Don't compromise. Take the 2 years. You won't regret it. That's patience. It's speaking into our life and saying, don't be so impulsive. Yeah, I know you feel a certain way. But let me give you some perspective. And that's what patience does, and that's what patient people are like. If you ever sat around a patient person, they're going to give you perspective, and oftentimes it's over experience because they've learned and they've grown, and they're like, oh, and guess what? Here's what we know. Wisdom doesn't always work out immediately, but over time with patience, we will gain wisdom ultimately. In that scenario, I gained some wisdom. Don't cut short your present and forsake your future. It's the Jacob and Esau principle. Don't cut short your present and forsake your future. Don't jump to conclusions. Don't be impulsive and throw everything else away because of a feeling that you have right now. So patience doesn't overreact. It's more perspective driven and less impulsive driven. The second thing is this. Patience is purposeful. It values living more intentionally versus living less randomly. Okay? That's what patience does. It chooses to be intentional. It says, I may not get what I want now, but I'm going to get what I want ultimately. So let's talk about some scenarios. Finances. There's a lot of times when you want something. A new car, new pair of shoes, whatever it is. But if you're living your life more intentionally, you're going to be less random in your spending. So last night, from the time that we recorded this, Sarah and I went and sat down and retooled our budget. We had some different goals and things like that we wanted to do. Well, guess what? We said we're going to live intentionally. We have a lot of margin in our budget. Praise the Lord. We're thankful for that. But we want to use that intentionally instead of just randomly. Like, we don't want to look back and say, man, look at all that excess that we had, and we spent it on McDonald's here and on a shirt here. We want to look back and say, but here's how we intentionally lived. That's what patience does. It's more intentional. It's not random. It doesn't bounce around everywhere. It's living life in an intentional way because it leads to wisdom. It leads to wisdom. It leads to that. Sarah and I have been able to do this in our life in a lot of ways. Praise the Lord. And sometimes we're not really good at it, but in other times we're really, really good at it, and that's living intentionally. And I remember when we were living on way less and we had a very strict budget, and we learned through intentionality how to be wise with money. And because we were wise with money, then I think it's easier for us to be wiser now because we look at each other and say, well, we've already done it. We've already done it on less, and we can do it even more. But it's given us the ability to sit down with other people and help them plan their finances. Hey, my budget's way out of whack. Well, hey, let's sit down and talk. And we walk through the process. So patience is purposeful. It's living more intentionally and less randomly.